Hi, we're Students for Health Awareness, an organization dedicated to raising awareness and donation for rare diseases. So we've done some of our own research for our first campaign, which is congenital muscular dystrophy, but we've also wanted to invite an expert in the field, Dr. Manzini, for deeper insights and firsthand knowledge. So we're honored to have you here with us, and thank you for joining us. So we wanted to start by hearing a little bit about your inspiration to specialize in CMD.
Yes.
Rishi, do you want to start?
Yeah,
First of all,
so
thank you so
sorry,
much
what?
for inviting me.
Yeah, no worries. So our first question was, just want to get to know more about you. Like, give us a quick introduction about yourself. Who are you? And, what inspired you to specialize in CMD?
So I am an associate professor in neuroscience and cell biology at the Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. And I run a research laboratory that, among other things, focuses on CMD. And my general training is in neurogenetics, which is basically a discipline where you look for genetic mutations in people, in humans, that cause different types of neurological and neurodevelopmental disorders. And I actually came to CMDs from that angle because I study a group of CMDs that also have very severe brain and eye malformations. And so they're genetic mutations that not only affect the muscle, but they also affect several other tissues and also cause profound intellectual disability and cognitive learning deficits.
Okay. Good to know. Great to know. So our next question had to do with understanding what CMD was. So
Mhm.
during our research, we learned a lot of the different types of muscular dystrophy, but in what way does congenital muscular dystrophy differ from these other types, or what makes it special?
Well, it's the congenital part.
Okay.
So it's a muscular dystrophy, and so it's diagnosed the same way as like muscular dystrophy, muscle weakness, deficits in regeneration of the muscle fibers. But the congenital means that you have it at birth. And
Mm-hmm.
so, in general, a baby with CMD is what is called clinically a floppy baby, even if it doesn't sound like a very clinical term, because they have what's called hypotonia, which means like all of their muscles are very relaxed and very floppy. And so the baby has no ability to hold itself up.
So it's
Mm-hmm.
a genetic disease, so it's passed hereditary.
It's
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
yeah, it's
okay.
primarily a lot of these congenital disorders that affect several tissues in babies tend to be genetic.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And so CMDs are primarily genetic, and in most cases they are recessive, which means that you have to receive a mutation from your mom and a mutation from your dad, and the parents are unaffected because of the two chromosomes that they
Yeah.
have. One has the mutation, the other one doesn't, so the other compensates. But then the kid will get two different mutations, and then the two hits cause the disease.
Yeah. So I have a question. So are carriers affected in any way? Like even if they don't have both copies, do they still have any effects?
So, as far as CMDs, no, but what has been interesting is that, for example, in some of the other brain disorders that we study, the child that has the two mutations, they have a very severe disruption of the brain where the brain doesn't develop normally, doesn't have the usual pattern of like gyrations, and the parents may end up having psychiatric
Mm-hmm.
conditions, and so their brain
Okay.
looks fine, but it depends on the gene, it depends on the
Okay.
mutation. And so
So
the parents may have something a little bit less severe, but in most cases the parents are really, and the siblings with only a heterozygous mutation are really unaffected.
So I have a question. Is CMD a sex-linked trait? So is it passed down through the sex chromosomes, or is it to the other?
That is, well, so it depends. Again, it depends on the gene, right? So you might be thinking of Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which is on the X chromosome.
Okay.
But there is also one type of CMD, which is Emery-Dreifuss muscular
Okay.
dystrophy, which is also on the X chromosome. And
Okay.
so it's not necessarily the CMD itself, it's just that that one gene happens to be on the X chromosome. And so that means that usually is transmitted from the mom, because you only get the Y from the dad,
Okay.
and that the affected child is usually a boy.
Hmm.
Usually boy. Okay. All right. That makes sense. So if you were to just another question, but if you were to like give a statistic off the top of your head of, how many babies in a 10,000 or 100,000 could be affected by CMD, what would that
We're
number
talking
be?
about 100,000. I mean, there are many, many rare diseases.
Okay.
And so at the end, there are a lot of people with different rare diseases. But for CMDs, um, it depends on the population, and there are different studies. So in general, for
Okay.
CMDs, maybe 1 in 100,000. Some of the ones that I study, it's like less than 1 in 400,000.
Or
But
in
for
front.
some
Oh, got it.
particular groups, we don't know. So they are very, very rare.
Okay. All right.
Hmm.
Um, so now I want to move more into like diagnosis and challenges. So, in your opinion, what are some of the common challenges faced by you and some of your other peers and colleagues in treating CMD? And it could be, it could be scientifically based, or it could be ethics or anything, bioethics.
It's primarily, I mean, it's primarily because they're very rare, and so your average neurology center, uh, your average neurologist may see one of these kids in their entire career if they're
Hmm.
lucky, right? I mean, in general, if the kid has, again, as we were saying, like, is really floppy, is like severe hypotonia at birth, they can figure out pretty quickly what they have. For some less severe ones, sometimes it takes a little bit of like investigation, and so you have to bring in different people. So for example, for the kids that I work on, you'll need an ophthalmologist to look at their eyes, and then you'll need neurology to do an MRI, and then it takes a little bit of investigation, which then of course depends on like which hospital you're at, right? Do they have for peds do they have a NICU? Do they have for peds all of the specialists that they have to look through? So in a lot of cases for rare diseases, that's what's called a little bit of diagnostic odyssey, because you see they have these issues, and then you have to figure out how each child presents, which means like what are all of the symptoms that they have, and then come to a diagnosis. And in general, now that genetic testing is like widespread and like widely accepted, then the kid with this type of presentation will end up in like what medical genetics, which is the disciplines that deals with all of these likely genetic disorders. They will order a genetic test, which can be for CMDs like just what's called the panel. So there is a list of genes that we know cause this disorder, and so those will be tested. And sometimes they'll do the whole genome.
Got it.
It really depends on like what you're looking for.
Hmm.
Um, in general, for research, we do the whole genome because it's actually cheaper
Yeah.
for us.
Yeah.
But for clinic, no, because insurance companies charge a lot of money for these tests.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Um,
So we want to move on to like the actual quality of life for the patients. So we know CMD often like um, causes the patient to lose like a lot of their lifespan. They don't make it past, I don't know, like 15 is what I read. So how does CMD impact the lives of those affected, both physically and emotionally?
Um, it's a severe disorder, right? So it definitely impacts your mobility, your ability, their ability sometimes to even be able to like sit and stand. It completely depends on the genetic mutation and the severity. So we have some of the kids that we've been working on that also have these very severe brain malformations. So they're blind, they have issues, like they're with their entire brain, and they can't move. So in general, they're in it's not even a wheelchair, like in a stroller.
Yeah.
And in a lot of cases, they will die by 3 to 5 years of age. And then there are less severe CMDs where they may they'll survive longer and they can do much better, especially when the brain is not affected. But it does impact your ability to survive in the long term because the muscles like keep degenerating, and then you start having breathing difficulties, and so that's really what ends up being most difficult for some of them.
Mm-hmm. So are there any treatment options available for these CMD patients, like depending on severity, and are they effective? They increase life expectancy for the patients, things such as that?
So there are a lot of therapies in development.
Like physical therapy to enhance
physical therapy, but the physical therapy is interesting because you always have to figure out, so because the muscle is degenerating and regenerating, you have to figure out the sweet spot where you're not killing a muscle that is not going to develop anymore and you're keeping it active. And so that's always an interesting discussion. And like one of the main issues is that people also have to find the right specialists because these are very rare. And so there are often organizations and patients group where they talk to each other and they kind of say, okay, this is what you need to do, this is what has helped me, and then everybody kind of like has to check whether it works for them. Because yes, you can do physical therapy, but then if you do too much, you may end up causing like more severe muscle damage. And then it depends on the different types of interventions for some of these kids. Like some of them cannot speak, but then some of them are able to use a communication device the same way as kids with autism or intellectual disability that are not verbal. In general, for muscular dystrophy, steroids can be given for Duchenne muscular dystrophies and other type of muscular dystrophies that develop after birth. Now there are several gene therapies that either have been approved or they're in course of development. And for some of the congenital muscular dystrophies, there are similar approaches that are being developed to be able to reintroduce the gene that is missing into the muscle and then be able to restore the function. For some of the ones that we work on, it's more complicated because they develop very early and during fetal development, and so you would actually have to intervene probably between the first and the second trimester. Sometimes you so they usually
that's really early.
They can get diagnosed around 20 weeks. But that's I mean, we're not at the stage right now where we do gene therapy in utero, though there have been reports in the past few years of enzyme replacement, for example, in utero for other types of muscle disease. So we're getting closer. It just has to be safe. It has to be safe for the mom. It has to be safe for the baby. It's like
Yeah. So actually, you kind of touched upon this, but maybe not in depth. But we were gonna are there any promising research developments or upcoming treatments that you're excited about, specifically like gene therapy? So like, something that me and Kian are really interested in is CRISPR-Cas9, and that's it's not new, but it's a relatively recent development. So, you may have touched upon this, but like, are there any like, new promising gene therapy treatments, like you talked about, like, for example, in the uterus that you can talk about?
Yeah, so in utero still there is not much, but gene therapy now is approved for certain diseases, like really very very early in like young children, and there is improvement in getting it to the brain, which I think is very exciting. It's still very difficult to get it into the brain, and it's also difficult to get it into the muscle. And so the trying to figure out the right vectors, like the way to get it in, that has been one of the big challenges, but we are getting there. And so there are more and more and more of these gene therapies that are being approved. For specifically for congenital muscular dystrophy, I think there's some very interesting work on laminin alpha 2, which is one type of muscular dystrophy where they're trying to substitute other laminins. So this is part of like the sheet of proteins that surrounds cells, and you're losing this link that disrupts like tissue integrity. And so there are different types of replacement like gene therapies that are being at least studied, trying to figure out whether it's feasible, whether the mechanism is feasible.
Yeah. So these haven't been implemented yet. Any of the ones that you just touched upon, or
they're working on it. You have to,
okay.
They're working on the vectors, and I think in a lot of cases they're still in animal models. I think for some of the disorders I work on, but the least severe forms where you can still do the trials in adults, there is also gene therapy that's being developed, and kind of like going through the safety and initial phases. In general, for clinical trials, you have to start with adults in most cases, and then you go into the
Kids,
into the young, actually the adolescents, and then you go
and
into
the
the
kids.
kids.
Okay.
Yeah.
But if it's a disease that is very severe, that of course does not get to adolescents, then you do the trials in the kids, but you have to be very careful, of course. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
because sorry.
Sorry, you want to go, Kian?
So wait, actually you go first.
No, go ahead.
I kind of forgot.
Okay, no worries. So my question for you was, what is your team working on, like specifically, that's contributing, or research that contributes to developing a cure for any type of CMD?
Yeah, so we are working on these very very severe CMDs that again disrupt multiple tissues and the brain and the muscle, the retina, the front of the eye, so they'll have cataracts, that have all different kinds of issues. And so we are still working mostly on the mechanism and trying to figure out exactly what's happening, why are all of these different tissues affected, what is going on basically. And for that we actually use the zebrafish, which is an animal model that people kind of know that researchers work on fish, but fish is actually a great model for muscle disease, and there are many 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 labs around the world.
Well, can you explain why a little bit?
Yeah, they use zebrafish because pretty much, I mean, zebrafish is a vertebrate like us. It has a skeleton and is just like, and their muscle structure and function is pretty similar. The same mechanisms that are at play in like development of our muscle are at play in their muscle. And the zebrafish, because it's fertilized externally, so the mom would release the eggs and the dad fertilizes them, and she makes hundreds of eggs, and so you can make 1,000 babies in like a day if you want. And because they're externally fertilized, you can watch them develop from like the single cell, the first fertilized oocyte, to every single step of development, and they develop quickly. And so some of the dystrophinopathy models will start showing muscle disease after 3 or 4 days, and so you can actually very quickly study what is going on. And the other thing, though I was saying we're still looking at the mechanism. We're also doing therapeutics. What is great is that you have hundreds of fish you can test drugs on, and they're tiny, so you can screen. So what we're doing right now is a drug screen on different compounds to try and improve muscle health. That is not going to directly change the genetic defect like gene therapy does, but hopefully we'll see if we can find something that's going to make them feel better and be stronger, which would still affect quality of life. And so we're using CRISPR, but we're using CRISPR for the wrong way, so to break genes.
Yeah.
And so we're using CRISPR to make several mutants of different genes involved in these disorders to then study their development and figure out what's happening. And that is also because the mice are actually not a good model for these diseases, because the way the embryo develops in a mouse is different from humans, and in the mouse these proteins cause a deficit in early development of the mouse embryo, so you don't even get a mouse, while instead you'd get a human.
Mm-hmm. So we know that research for CMD is kind of like or like rare diseases in general are kind of like under funded. So how do you think like individuals and organizations can contribute to CMD research and, as well as support efforts?
Yeah. So there's a lot of great organizations. And so the drug screening that I was telling you about is actually funded by CureCMD. Mm-hmm. So I highly recommend
we actually know
everybody
them.
goes to the CureCMD website. I think they're going to launch a campaign very soon, and they are absolutely wonderful. Yeah. Because they work in partnership with the families, with the organizations, and so every time they have a conference, all the families are there, and we get to meet the families and talk to them, and the kids are running around in their wheelchairs, and it's kind of just like a very exciting time to, so that they can see what we're doing, but also they can get together and talk to each other and like figure out how they can help each other with the progression of the different diseases. And so CureCMD is definitely the one where there's a lot of information on their website. They're really doing a wonderful job. The Muscular Dystrophy Association, the MDA, is the larger muscular dystrophy foundation that covers every single type of muscular dystrophy and neuromuscular disease. So they'll also fund like ALS, spinal muscular atrophy, and like all of these other aspects. And then there are a lot of like smaller foundations. I mean, what ends up happening is that families just try to figure out of these rare diseases, the families will really organize together and start to create these organizations to talk to each other, to support each other, but also to try and collect funds to push research in different directions. And so there's several smaller foundations that are working in this space.
Mm. That's really wonderful. So before we finish the interview, we wanted to ask a little bit more about your personal experience on congenital muscular dystrophy. So could you share a particular like impactful story that stayed with you throughout your career with us?
Yeah, there are many.
Mm-hmm. If you have to choose one, if one patient.
If I have to choose one that particularly spurred me, is that in my particular case, for the diseases that I work on, the muscle disease is important, but for the families, the brain part is a lot more impactful because they want to be able to interact with their child. They can't tell, sometimes what is going on. And it was fascinating to me once, and I was talking to some of the moms, and somebody was saying, I mean, the doctors were saying, okay, its brain is completely jumbled. There's nothing they can do. It's just like, and then they gave the kid a communication device, and they started using the communication device. So it meant that it was not that bad. And I've seen it multiple times. Sometimes you see an MRI that is so messed up, and then the kid walks in, and you're just like, how? Like the brain is like, you wouldn't expect that brain would be able to do that, but the
Yeah.
brain is very, very powerful, and so and it's able to adapt. And so for me, that really spurred me, as maybe also we can push, even if the brain is already malformed by the time they're born, we can still push it to do better and help them be able to communicate with their families. So that was one of the most interesting for me.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Manzini. It's all the questions we have to you so far. If you'd like to add anything before this ends, now would be the perfect time. Anything to any
Uh,
of our viewers.
no, thank you so much for it. I mean, what you're doing and the fact that you're promoting awareness to like rare diseases is really great. And there are so many, and I think it's really, really important. And so please support all of the organizations that work on congenital muscular dystrophy and muscular dystrophy. Remember that February 29th is Rare Disease Day, and it's not only celebrated every 4 years like this year, but it's February 28th in all the other years. And so continue to do this work and promote this type of awareness. I think it's wonderful.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Manzini, and thanks to all the supporters who took the time to view this. Stay tuned for more updates.